Welcome to the final episode of the Ruy Lopez Masterclass. Today we are closing by looking at part 2 of the main lines, and specifically we are looking at the main lines, so starting with knight f6 and then the bishop not coming to c5. We looked at this in the previous episode, but the bishop coming to e7. Now I highly recommend you watch the previous video before watching this one. I don't make prerequisites in this masterclass, but this is one that I do think is useful to keep because this is largely a part 2, an extension of the previous chapter where we went very deeply into the main ideas that you have in these main lines, and many of those main ideas remain at your disposal here in these lines as well. So I highly recommend that you watch that video. So essentially all of the sidelines are the black options without moving the knight to f6 and then making a decision about the bishop. So that means that it is, for example, d6 or a6 and then d6 or bishop c5 or f5, the Schliemann gambit or the Smyslov with g6 or the Kozio or the bird with knight d4. All of these are the sidelines that we've already looked at. The main lines are them moving the knight to f6. We always respond with knight to f6 in these main lines with d3, and then moving the bishop and making a decision about this piece. So either they can move the bishop to c5, this is what we saw in the previous video, or like we're going to look at today, they can move the bishop to e7. But they have to be a little bit more careful about moving the bishop to e7 in these lines as opposed to moving the bishop to c5, because if they move the bishop to e7 too prematurely after we play d3, then we're able to take the knight and then just take the pawn, right? We had this threat. Now bishop to c5, like we looked at in the previous chapter, stopped this threat because of queen to d4, forking the knight and the f2 pawn. And therefore, against bishop e7, you always want to check, can I just win a pawn? And this is why black often, if they play for bishop e7 setups, they're going to start with d6. Obviously, the bishop is not coming to c5. That doesn't matter, though. They want the bishop on e7, but they're going to start with d6 just to secure their pawn. So you're going to see this in a lot of our main lines today and in a lot of our games. And I just wanted to point that out. The reason they're doing this is to never fall victim to losing a center pawn early on. Now, aside from this of moving the knight out and then moving the bishop to e7, the other point that I want to mention is that they can also throw in a6 whenever they want. So they can throw in a6 here and then move the knight. We respond in the same way by playing d3. And then here, again, they can't move the bishop to e7 on account of the same trick. So they can play d6 though. And whenever they play d6 in these structures, I respond with c3, much like how we respond against bishop c5 in the previous video. So against d6, I very much like c3, and specifically I recommend this because it gives our bishop the escape path on c2. So for example, just to put this into an example, if we castle here, they can play b5 and already start targeting our bishop. This is a little uncomfortable. So whenever they play d6, they are threatening this idea of b5 and moving the knight away to a5 because now d6 defends the pawn, so they can get away with moving the knight without dropping the pawn. So whenever they threaten this by playing d6, play c3. Okay, you're going to see this very repeatedly in this video as well. So essentially, whenever they play knight f6, if they haven't made a decision about the bishop, we're in the main lines, we play d3, and then if they play d6, we play c3, and the way that they can start by moving the bishop would be to first go b5 and then bishop e7, and here, there's no need to start or rush with c3 because they haven't played d6 yet. But if they ever play d6, we play c3. If they don't, for example, they castle, we make our normal moves. If they play d6, we play c3. If they don't, we make better moves. If they play d6, we play c3, so on. So I'll talk about these lines in a moment, but that's the general breakdown of how to conceptualize the video today. What we're going to be talking about, it's them moving the knight to f6 and then committing the bishop to a passive but solid post on e7, where often they're going to start by playing d6 to secure their pawn, and we're going to meet that knight f6 with d3 and d6 with c3. So then what is the difference between this video and the previous video, right? If the only difference is the bishop either on e7 or c5, does that actually have any consequences? Does it have any implications for the remainder of the game? Well, it does. Here's the way I would think about it. Once the bishop comes to c5, they're anyways playing d6, right? They need to develop their bishop and control their center, and therefore the bishop on c5 is unable ever to retreat to f8. That is the key difference. The bishop on e7 has a bit added flexibility, where often they can try to buff up the kingside. And if you recall in the previous video, the kingside with the bishop on c5 and the pawn on d6, that was the weakest point in black. We got many attacking games in the previous video. So with the bishop on e7, they can try to play g6, bishop back to f8, then to g7, and really secure some extra squares, securing the king, therefore. Now, they don't always do this, and we'll see plenty of examples where they're not going to move the bishop after they move to e7 and they castle and bring the rook, and they're not going to regroup the bishop to g7, but that is kind of one of the big conceptual differences between the two videos. But aside from that, the concepts and the ideas and the plans that I just outlined in the previous couple of minutes, with the piece maneuvers, with the breakthroughs that I just showed with all of these arrows, that's going to take you a long way. So let's begin jumping in. I'm going to look at this main line by looking at a6 first, bishop a4, knight f6. Again, we respond to knight f6 with d3. And here we're going to look at b5 and bishop e7. So against bishop e7, again, we're not forced to play c3. There's nothing wrong with c3, but I like to prioritize developing and only play c3 once they play d6, and therefore threaten to go knight a4, knight a5, targeting our bishop because the pawn here on e5 is defended. So against bishop e7, let's castle. Let's get that out of the way. And here, if they play d6, we play c3. Let's keep going though. Let's say they don't. Let's say they castle as well. We bring the rook to e1. Here, if they play d6, we play c3 as well. That's not an issue. And if they don't, they can try bishop e7. I think this is one of the main moves here. Often, the bishop won't find a very good home along this diagonal. And in these variations, it can be very strong along this longer diagonal here, fianchettoing. So bishop b7 is one of the key ideas. We're continuing with our knight maneuver. And here d6, at some point they're going to play for this. Again, we go c3. And here we're already going to look at a couple of branching points. So after we play c3, there's really one typical idea for them, which is to move the knight away to be able to play c5 and then bring the knight back. And they can do this in a couple of ways. They can either move the knight to a5. Let's start by looking at this. We bring the bishop to c2. This was the benefit of playing c3 after d6. We allow ourselves to save our bishop, which is very strong. So knight a5, bishop c2, and now c5. And here, this knight maneuver, we finally have some time to finish that up. So the knight comes to g3. We've done kind of everything right. We've responded to a6, b5 with bishop c2. We've castled, put the rook on e1. We've completed our knight maneuver. It's time to strike, d4. And by the way, you can also notice that black is indeed going for this idea of maneuvering the bishop to fianchetto it on g7. And after they take in the center here, we're going to take back, of course. Notice we have very strong center control. They can bring the knight back to c6. This was one of their main ideas. But d5. Right, let's close the center, right? We also saw this many times in that previous video. Now, after knight b4, bishop b1, let's preserve our bishop and look to kick away the knight with a3. The knight is forced back, and now we can regroup and rebring our bishop out. And you see one of the key ideas, this pawn on b5 and the light squares become super weak. You can certainly imagine, and I am doing a little bit of foreshadowing, the queen coming to e2 and putting a lot of pressure on this pawn here. And we didn't even have to play a4 and trade a pawn because they've gone a5, and therefore they've forever weakened the square. So b5 is hit. They played knight to c7 to defend, bishop to e3. Let's bring the bishop into the game. And this game, ladies and gentlemen, was won completely on the queen side, right? This setup here is much harder to crack as opposed to the setup with our bishop on c5. And therefore, there are cases where you attack the king. We'll see a little bit of that today as well. But often, the queen side is where I really like to play. You can see the bishops are really strong. We have this open c-file. We have the center, which points to the queen side. All hints are pointing that we should be playing on this side of the board. So we double the rooks. And this is also a key thing that I like to show. This knight is on f3 and the knight is on g3. We're never actually forced to keep these knights here, right? This is a good starting point, but if we see that the play is really beginning to develop on the queen side, it is often in our good interest to remaneuver the knight actually to that side of the board, and you'll see that in this video, in this game here. I think it's a very instructive point. Now, black sort of pretended to get some play on our king, right? We've kind of abandoned the king side, we've gone for the queen side, and black has realized I don't have nearly enough pieces to hold together the queenside. Look at this absolute monster of a setup that white has built. I can't defend this, so let me just try to switch and attack the king. But that's not going to work. They don't have enough energy to do that, and they try to kind of pretend like they're actually attacking, but the truth is we just won a couple of pawns, and this attack on the king is only an illusion. Our king on h1 is safe. We have to be careful, but with enough precision, with a little bit of care, white ended up winning this game with no problem, and it was precisely and solely the queenside which won the game for white. Right here, we have an extra piece. Black had to sacrifice it because otherwise the queenside was running, and after king f8 and queen d2, we are holding together this extra pawn. We have an extra knight as well. Game over. So I think that was a nice game, and I think it points out a couple of things. First of all, the power of our queenside play. Second of all, the flexibility of our knights, not being afraid to remaneuver them sort of towards that queenside of, and that actually ended up paying dividends in this game here, right? The knight was a key attacker. So I think this was a helpful example. Let's back up for a moment. Because when they played knight a5, there's another path that their knight could have gone to. They could have gone knight b8. This is also very common. The knight often comes to d7. Meanwhile, black maintains the idea of c5. We're going to continue normally. The knight comes to g3. We tuck away the bishop on c2. And here, we strike with d4. So you can see this as a common theme. d4 is certainly the way that we want to try to make progress in these positions once we've achieved our optimal setup. So d4, h3. No reason to rush. The bishop can come to g5, trying to make a point of some of the dark squares, queen to d2, and d5. Again, locking up the center. You've seen this time and time again in this video and in the previous one. This is a key idea for us. c4, by the way, I should note, c4 is a really important here, a really important move for black here, because often the knight on d7 is a really weird placed piece, and so they want to play c4 and then knight to c5. And if they don't play c4 immediately, we're able at times to play b3 and then meet c4 with b4, and they won't be able to take en passant, and therefore we no longer allow the knight to come to c5. So that is a nuance to take notice of. So they have to rush with c4. We bring the bishop back to e3, controlling the square that black really wants to bring a knight to, and then we can play for b4 anyways, right? So it's possible to do this anyways. It would have been stronger if they couldn't take en passant, but we can't always choose. Queen to c7, and again, the queenside is our point of domination here, with such a solid setup for black and a sort of intentional neglecting the queenside with the bishop on e7 rather than c5, it makes sense to crash in the center and then use that as a launching pad to also play on the queenside. And you see that indeed here, the knights again maneuvering, right? Very instructive, both of the knights from g3 and f3 maneuvering into the game on the queenside. And on the queenside, we're often just going to win. Now, there were a couple of inaccuracies. In fact, this move, knight c3, was not so strong. So white didn't play optimally, and the game ended up soon actually in a draw. So in this position, they agreed to a draw. But you saw, just from a conceptual standpoint, the play on the queenside for white is driving the game, and black has to respond. You can see here, the bishop, when they played g6, surely their idea was to put the bishop on g7, but we dragged their bishop to the queenside. We forced their hands because we are putting so much pressure on the queenside, they have to respond. If they don't, then we're going to blow them off the board, much like what we saw in the previous game, where instead of responding to our queenside ideas, they went for their own kingside attack, and it fell on its face. And so we drive really the course of the game, and I think practically speaking, we have a much easier time doing so. This takes us to our final game example, which I think is also super instructive. So let's back up for a moment, which is after bishop e7, knight to d2, not playing d6 and c3, but continuing to delay that. So rook e8, and we can continue to delay it, right? We don't have to rush with c3. And after bishop to f8, now we do need to play c3, because d6, again, the point was it defends the pawn, enabling knight a5, trapping our bishop. Rook e8 now is the other way to defend the pawn, enabling knight a5, trapping our bishop. So we have to play c3 to give ourselves a little bit of breathing room for the bishop in case of knight a5. And by only playing c3 when it was necessary, we've really prioritized good development. I should note that striking doesn't only mean d4, right? A lot of times this is the move you want to be looking for. But again, a4 is a very legitimate move here, often combined with d4, but not necessarily needed to be combined with d4. And also, there isn't, zero attacking possibilities, right? This is something I want to make a note of. If you, instead of playing for d4, which is totally a solid way to play, if you want to prioritize kingside play, there are ways to do this. So look at what white does here. He plays knight g5, hitting f7, forcing the rook to an awkward square, and then after a4, h6, we're actually happy to see h6, right? We've not only pushed the rook to a bad square, we've pushed the pawn to a bad square, and that is 10 times worse because the rook can simply move back. The pawn doesn't have that luxury. And now h4, h5 becomes an idea that white can go for. So we're not forgetting about our kingside play, and in the first two examples in this video, you maybe saw that it was mostly queenside play, and that is true. That is one of our biggest ways to make progress, but the kingside is also a legitimate battleground that we can engage in. So h4, h5 here, fearing h5 from white was played, and the dark squares really become a point of weakness. And I love what white did here. Look at this. They clear up and clarify the situation on the queen side by taking on b5 and then trading the rooks. And then they play knight h2. And their whole point is that we're not going to worry about any tension on this side of the board. We're simply going for the throw, right? We're going for the king. And here, after knight h2, the rook indeed wasted a tempo, bringing itself back into the game, maybe hoping to infiltrate on this a-file, but it's too slow, rook e3. And I've ended the variation here because the rook is coming to f3, where it pressures the knight. The knight has a hard time moving. If it comes to g4, there could be ideas and issues on f7, right? So rook to f3 is a serious threat. If the knight moves, f7 is hit. If the knight doesn't move, they have to defend it. And the only way to do so is to enter a pin, which is not something that you really want to do. h5 is also a point of weakness if we can play for g4. The attack very much plays itself, and white is the only party here having fun. So I've ended the variation here, not to get too excited, but I think that white has a really fun game ahead of themselves. And I illustrated this game, and I'm ending the video with this game to show you that while the queenside is often a place that is neglected in these passive setups where black focuses on the kingside, and we can often play on this queenside and get a good game, we can also, if we really want to, and if the position allows it, we can also play on the kingside, and you shouldn't only tunnel vision on the queenside. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Again, I'd highly recommend you watch the previous video where we talked about very shared ideas, and you can kind of see some of the contrasting values. And one of the key notes is with the bishop on c5, we had a lot more attacking games in the previous video and fewer queenside games. And I think that is a cool parallel to note, where the bishop, whether it comes to c5 or more passively sits on the king side, that can influence where we should be concentrating our forces and our ideas. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you also enjoyed this masterclass. It was a pleasure creating this for you. I hope you like this repertoire. I prioritized consistency and practicality, sometimes admittedly at the cost of a little bit of objective value, but always I tried to emphasize the ideas and the main plans, and I think I've given you a very strong practical weapon that certainly can be used and has been used at titled player levels as well, and grandmasters have all played these lines as well. So you don't have to engage in the main lines to play the Ruy Lopez well. You can also play very typical and strong Ruy Lopez positions by avoiding the theory with these d3 setups. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions whatsoever, leave them in the comment section down below. Subscribe if you're new around here, like the video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.